In today's episode, we will be looking at the brand new kit released to coincide with release of the new Avatar movie. We will be looking at the LEGO Avatar Kit 75573 Floating Mountains. I'm going to take you through how I built the diorama, as well as show you speed builds for the kit as well. There were some tricky modelling aspects for this alien landscape, which I had to get creative with, but I am really happy with how it came out. In the last video, I talked about using foam, which most modelers do, and I do intend to do in the future. With all my dioramas so far though, I have used cardboard as the base, and that's because it's easy to get, it's cheap, it's light, and it's a good way to recycle. But that being said, I did want to show you that I do actually have the foam, and here it is. Look, I know classic modeller's foam is used by modelers everywhere. The thing is, and this was only compounded by Christmas, there is just so much cardboard being thrown out. So, I'm going to use the cardboard again. As you can see here, I spent time on making the base thicker to support the larger area and the different aspects of the base plate. After cutting various pieces of cardboard into squares, I glued them together to make the baseboard. I did not need to exactly match it, as the sculpted will tie it together, and I do want grooves there to act as cracks, that look like cracks in the cliff face. After trying a few cliff edge designs, I created a template to make it easy to follow when I was cutting, to make sure I got what I wanted. Once the cliff face was done, I used a scalpel just around the front edge to help with the sculpted. In this model, I've decided to make sides as well as a back to give it the feeling being closed in by the plants at Site 26. I will add some curves to them, but they are there to focus the eye back onto the kit. I also cut out a second rock face that will be glued to one of the side mountains. This will help give that side mountain some depth and a bit more personality. One thing I picked up whilst making the baseboards was that I had the orientation the wrong way. Here you can see the cliff face and the building on the Lego box. When you look at this picture that was part of the Lego instructions and from the movie, you can see those boxes and where the cliff face in the building are. This means that the picture on the box was taken this way. To match this, it means I need to turn my baseboard to match the picture. I think the baseboard would still be big enough, but if I need to, I can trim it. It does mean I need to double check the model's going to fit, so let's go on to doing the speed build. This build has been one of my favourites so far. I think this kit has really maintained the feel of the movie and stayed true to the cleverness of LEGO kits. It was a very exciting one to build. The model building is a great representation of the one in the movie and has the main parts needed for good playing. It has Jake's link unit that makes the avatars possible, and the computer desk for Dr. Grace to nag Jake. Model as part of the plant life was a really clever addition and added some dimensions to the set. The mix of greens and browns with the small touches of purple in the flowers represents the Pandoran plant life really well, and when on display helps lift the kit. The locking mechanism for the SA2 works well and is nicely balanced to take the weight. In the movie, the Samson looks really mean, and I think they've transferred that look to the model. The sharp edges, the use of technical parts, the sensors on the front of the aircraft, these all add up to make a great looking aircraft. Even Trudy's character looks like she's ready for action. One thing about the characters that really shows how well LEGO thinks things through is for the human characters, the heads have a standard inside face and an outside face with the mask they had in the movie. Even Trudy has her normal face and her war paint face as well. The instructions had still shots from the movie scattered throughout the booklet, which helped provide a reference and keep the feel or the link between the instructions and the movie. Now I have the kit built and you can test the layout. The baseboard is the right size, so there's no need to change that. Due to the weight of the floating mountain, I'm going to build a stand that can independently hold its weight. Once I bend the wire into shape, I sprayed it with glue and then started to dust it with grout and the dirt mixture. The grout is beige tile grout and the dirt is from the garden, which I sifted and mixed with the grout until I got the colour I wanted. I will then amend the baseboard so that the stand sits out of sight when the diorama is on display. I added a couple of applications until I got the consistency I needed, remembering that I want these to look like vines. I then used the airbrush to paint the grout dirt mixture without risking the paintbrush accidentally pushing it off the wire itself. The next step is to prepare to sculpt it to create the landscape. I ordered mine online in Australia as all locations don't stock it physically. I started by applying the sculptor to the base and then the cliff edge. I used various tools to make sure the cracks in the cliff edges looked right and remained there because I wanted to keep them. I also added it to the floating mountains that will make up part of the background. Using brown acrylic paint, I started to paint the baseboard so there was no cardboard showing through. I actually found the brown paint adds some extra colour and texture through the static grass, so it does achieve a lot and you really need to be careful which one you pick. With the sculpted now dry, I was ready to start painting the mountains and the cliff face. To do this, I mixed grey and white acrylic paint, mixing them together until I was happy with the shade of colour and the shade of grey. I had to be careful though when I was painting that I did not miss any small spaces or the tops of the mountains or the cracks, which is why I used the large brush. The next step was to add the skewers to the mountains so that I could slot them into the base. As you can see here, I cut the skewers to the length I required, and then I used the drill to make sure there was a nice snug hole for the skewer to fit into. I used a spot of glue to make sure that it stuck. One of the major components I needed to make, as you cannot buy them, is the purple bushes, some of which you can see in the pictures and in the movie. The first thing I did was to mix the blue and red paint until I got the dark shade of purple that I was looking for. I then simply painted a scrap piece of A4 paper, it was literally a letter I'd gotten in the mail, on both sides. Once dried, I cut the pieces of paper into thin strips, the width being the width I wanted for the leaves. Although they're not exactly the same, they look really good, and I'll be using this method in future models. I then glued and rolled these pieces of paper around a small stick, adding more leaves until I was happy with how bushy it was. Once I was happy with the number of leaves, I put a touch of glue on the outside to make sure they were stuck solid. As I mentioned earlier, the wire that's going to make the vines to hold up the floating mountain needed to be fitted under the main board. As you can see here, I'd bent the wire and then I traced out where that wire needed to go, and then using the scalpel, I cut a groove so it could fit into it. Next comes the fun part that turns a diorama from a lifeless piece of cardboard to a scene coming to life. Static grass really lifts dioramas, and even with my cheap version, it is well worth getting one. You can see here I'm tracing out where the mountains are going to go and adding masking tape so I don't waste putting static grass where it does not need to go. Static grass applicators vary in price, and although my cheap one has served me well, this will be the last time I use it because my new one is on its way. To get started, I first mix craft glue with a little water and then spread it out over the area I want the grass to go. Regardless of what you buy, many do come with some static grass that you can use to practice with. I'm starting with 2mm medium green grass and we'll add some longer grass later on. For this applicator, hold it around 2 to 3 centimeters from the surface and have the earth wire close to the area that you want the grass to go. It doesn't have to be right under it though. To darken the rocks, I added a black wash which helps make the shadows for the cracks and holes really darken up but also show up. To make the wash, I kept adding water to black acrylic paint until it was like a dark tea, and then added it to the areas that I wanted it to go. I used a paper towel to mop up the extra bits as I only wanted it in those certain areas. This also helped fill in a few spots that I may have missed before. The next steps were about adding depth to the scene, and this is where we add more dirt and flocking and things like that. The first step, as you can see, is I added more glue to the area I wanted the long grass to be, and then added the 7mm static grass, and this matches the picture straight from the movie. I then added some dirt to a bare patch at the back of the diorama that highlighted the area, gave it some difference, but also isolated it from the larger area of grass so it didn't look like I'd put carpet down. It looked like more of a real grass. You can see that I'm tapping the diorama. That's to help the dirt fall to the bottom of the grass so that when I spray it with glue, it doesn't stick to the top. Is about how I make my own flocking. It's really easy. All I do is just take some old foam from an old cushion and blend it up in a coffee grinder until it gets close to the size I want. Before it's finished, I add a little bit of paint that matches the colour that I want and then continue blending it. I found that this spreads out the paint really evenly and comes out well, except for white for some reason. That did not work at all. Now they add the two colours of flocking to the floating mountain. I did this by painting a 1-to-1 glue to water mixture onto the spots that I wanted to go, following the lines I made with the pencil. In case of the floating mountain, it was to highlight the watercourse and draw people's eyes to the waterfall. See here how I'm adding some of the background plants I made with the offcuts from the purple bushes. After adding some glue spots, I carefully added the plants to the areas I wanted them. I then continued to add more flocking to the various mountains to bring them to life and give them some depth. You can see here I added another background plant and then covered the glue spot with some more flocking. I then used my 1-to-5 glue to water mix via an eyedropper to put the glue on the flocking material to make sure it stays attached. Lastly, I used a paper towel to mop up the excess glue. To give the ground a mix of colour that is not obvious but really does make a difference, I started to add scattered flocking and the ground up leaf mixture to the grass. I first sprayed isopropyl alcohol on the grass to make sure that the surface tension was broken to help the glue spread evenly. I then spread the ground cover at random and sprayed the 1-to-5 glue mixture via the spray bottle over the extra scenery. For the floating mountain, to give it more interest, I added a waterfall using some of the polyester fibre painted white. I then stuck it to the mountain with a small spot of glue and then added more flocking to blend it in and mask the starting point. In this diorama, I only needed a few main trees to match the picture. After airbrushing the trunks, different shades, I made the small tree branches using the polyester fibre that I spread into different shapes. After spraying these with green paint, I then sprayed them in glue, being careful to only spray the polyester fibre. I dusted them with homemade dark green and purple flocking and a little bit of coarse turf just to help change the colour a little bit. As you can see, they have plenty of body and a really nice colour mix. The next step is to glue the mountains and blend them in. Firstly, I aligned them to the main board, and then I used a drill, small screwdriver and a skewer to make holes that were the right size to hold the mountains. Before inserting the mountains, I added some glue to each hole, which worked really well, and that bond was only strengthened when I added some more glue at the rear. I then proceeded to insert the rest of the mountain pieces onto the board. Before I could add the last mountain though, I needed to add the front part, which is held on with some more glue. Once that was all dry, I started to blend the mountain in with the main board. I started with polyester fibre painted green which made a great filler for the gaps between the mountain and the board. To help the flocking or coarse turf that I was adding to stick to the board, I used an eyedropper to get the glue mixture into the specific spots I had chosen. As we get closer to finishing the diorama, it's time to add the front bushes. Using the precision drill, I drilled holes in 3 locations around the scene. Similar to the mountains, I added a drop of glue and then placed the bush into those holes, making sure they were completely pushed in. I then spread some coarse turf around the base to help them blend in when needed. Again, using the plant offcuts, I made some more background plants and added them at a few key spots. The next task was to add the trees. Using the precision drill, I used a drill bit and a small screwdriver that were the same diameter as the tree trunks. This ensured a snug fit that only needed a small amount of glue. I just had to make sure that the orientation of the trees suited the model. I then did the same for the second tree using the same method as above. You can see here that they really do add depth to the model. I then created some more bushes in the same way as the trees, except with no trunks. I then put one above the main tree to give that real tree canopy, a small one in front of the building, and then one at the rear of the scene. I made sure they won't move by adding spots of glue at key points. And there you have it. This diorama is all done. We have our cliff face, we've got a floating mountains, a waterfall, and some really interesting plants. Another great Lego kit from Lego that added to our diorama looks awesome. I've ordered the parts and the kits for the next episode, and I'm really looking forward to sharing that journey with you. So I'll see you then.